Joining us from our on and off sister city of Charlottesville, Virginia, is Jesse Crosson. He is the founder of the Second Chancer Foundation, which you probably know from social media and Instagram and TikTok. His book is The Best Part of Prison, The Power of Second Chances and Reclaiming Life Out of Darkness. He, of course, spent half of his 40 plus years in jail. He got out in 2021. Former Governor Ralph Northam shortened his sentence, gave him a pardon, but he spent a good 19 years of a 32-year sentence, which was for, I guess, a gun charge and cocaine and whatnot. And we're here to talk about starting over. Did I summarize that correctly?
Sure. I mean, we can fix the details, but yeah, there was robbery and I shot two people. I committed unlawful wounding. So it was more serious, just cocaine and a gun. But yeah, also the guidelines, the day of sentencing called for from 8 to 13 years before I got 32. And there were some modifications, but it was still basically twice the high point of the guidelines. So it wasn't like the governor just stepped in and said, oh, I'm going to forgive this guy. It was a lot more like, hey, this was already really disproportionate with what the state said you should get.
So take me to the Wayback Machine. What were you at the so-called turn of the century? If I take you back in 2000, I think by some respects, I read you were a college-bound high schooler, but somewhat rudderless. And what were the events that led to kind of crashing and burning into 2002?
So yeah, I went through the process of, finding cocaine. I was exploring, I was looking around after college, or looking around getting ready for college, taking a year off and trying to find myself. But then the reality was that I just blew my life up because the moment I found cocaine, I felt like I had found the answer I was looking for. I felt like it was the answer to all of my insecurity, to all of my doubt, to all of my loss, to everything. The only problem is it only lasted about 15 minutes and then I had to get more. And when I found that, I just kept pursuing it and pursuing it. And in a matter of 3 months, went from that kid who was taking a year off before college to just completely losing myself and becoming like this feral animal whose only focus was to get more cocaine.
So talk to me about high school specifically, the stress of high school. And was there a history of substance abuse or self-medicating with other things, stress, panic attacks, depression? I mean, I'm no psychotherapist, but I want to get to that void that you so introspectively talk about trauma and talk about finding those things until you really found your true voice, which we're going to build up to in this interview. But take me again back to 2000 to 2002.
Sure. I mean, I would say it started even before high school. Growing up, I always felt like there was something wrong or there was something missing or everybody knew something that I didn't. And if only I could figure it out, then I would be okay or then I would be enough. And so I spent my life chasing achievement and chasing external validation. That if I got good enough grades or I did really well on this project or I did really well in sports, it was always some external thing that was going to make me okay. But it never worked. It always was like a cliff that I came to the edge of and then fell off and then wondered why I was feeling terrible again. Because I, in those moments of climbing and achieving, felt like, oh, I'm getting closer. Like this is going to be the thing that is going to make me okay. And then I was crestfallen all over again. So I'd gone through that process dozens of times from elementary school to high school. And then I felt like, okay, one of these days I'm going to find it. Maybe in this year I'm going to search and I'm going to meditate and I'm going to figure it out. Then I found cocaine and it felt like a short circuit, direct line into what I was looking for. And obviously,
how does a person just find cocaine? I wrote a book about cocaine and the history of cocaine in Miami and everything, and other people came to it for whole other reasons. But it had to have been filling a void or a boredom or a numbness or something. I want to get to that initial decision because you were making very rational decisions beforehand. Maybe they were fear driven, but you had to take a certain leap of faith at some point to try that cocaine.
At that, I was smoking marijuana and I was drinking, and it was this kind of behavior that was mostly around bonding. I wanted to do it with other people. It gave me an excuse to spend time with other people. It created this sense of camaraderie. And I remember the first time I was at a party and somebody pulled out cocaine, I was a little bit scared, but I watched how happy they seemed. And I was like, well, if they feel that happy, maybe like I'll feel good. Again, it just felt like a button or, the rat study where they keep pressing the button because it feels so good. I don't think I was really aware of the consequence of that study, but in my mind, I was like, I want to feel like that. And then, in that moment, I was willing to do anything. It was just, I would think I was willing to take risks because I felt like I'd been doing things right for most of my young life, that it didn't lead me anywhere. It didn't lead me where I wanted to be. So I was willing to take more risk. I was willing to do more things. And I was willing to kind of put myself out there because I thought, my dad was this weird hippie who had these ideas that everything from meditation to ayahuasca to, I don't know, orgies probably would lead him to happiness. So I think I kind of inherited that, or I kind of picked that up by osmosis. And so I was always looking for something, not realizing that nothing outside of me was ever going to make me happy. And that the more I chased them, especially with cocaine, the more I felt empty inside.
Jesse, what was that first bump like?
It was like ecstasy. It was It was a moment of everything I had always felt like I was lacking, just glowing from out of me. The strength and the security and the sureness and the bravado and the just, I felt full in the biggest way that I ever have in my life. And it felt like, okay, well, this is clearly it because I've never felt this way before. I don't feel like anybody's ever felt this way before. This must be the answer.
I think it reminds me of interviewing people in Hotel Scarface. They'd say you do that and you'd stay up all night chatting about how you were going to save the world and you'd feel omnipotent. And then at 9 or 10 in the morning, there was all this saving to do, but nobody wanted to do the saving. They didn't want to get out of bed and you just felt awful. I don't know what the other end of that must have felt, what the other end of that omnipotence maybe, I would think is trying to find that high and that fix again.
It is the exact opposite of the high of cocaine is the letdown of cocaine. It goes from one extreme of pure ecstasy and completeness to just absolute emptiness and absolute hopelessness. And I remember just sitting there and like you talk about the first night, staying up all night doing cocaine and like watching the sunrise and being terrified because I felt like it was my last day on earth. Being without cocaine after doing lines made it feel like I was drowning. It literally felt like I was going to die if I didn't get more. And it's something that's hard to describe if somebody hasn't been there because it is so all-consuming that there is no parallel I found.
So, were you in the back of your mind thinking you were going to find yourself? This was like I don't know, a vision quest for a year. You're taking a year off before college, but did you kind of think you were going to go off to college after you got this out of your system?
Yeah, I really, at least initially, I thought, okay, cool. This is going to be an experience. I'm going to have more to be able to relate to people about. I'm going to be more worldly. Like this is people go to college and they're in this ivory tower. Like I want real life experience. Of course, that isn't at all what happened, and it slowly degraded. Like it slowly became clear. Like when I was getting up in the morning and drinking because I didn't know how to deal with the day, or I was drinking at night and taking sleeping pills because I couldn't actually sleep from the cocaine. Like it slowly got worse and worse and worse. But it was almost like the frog boiling. Like I didn't recognize how bad it was, and I was surrounding myself with people who had normalized such extremes that I thought, okay, well, it's not so bad. Like lots of people have beer for breakfast, which again, if you had asked me 6 months before, I would have been horrified. But the people I was around, I was like, well, I'm not mainlining. I'm not using needles. So like clearly I'm not actually an addict. Like it was this constant process of justification and comparison. And I just had to keep finding people who are worse and worse off to continue to compare myself to them and feel like I wasn't doing so bad.
How were you making ends meet? Did you have a job to kind of tide yourself over? Were you living with your mom? Were you living still with your parents in that childhood situation?
So I had moved out of the house just after my 18th birthday and moved into a hotel with a buddy of mine. And we were staying there. And at that point, I had found a really good cocaine connection because I spoke Spanish and I was able to get it for cheaper than other people around. And after buying it, I got the initial line and then somebody else got me a connection. And it was just always so cost prohibitive. And I was working construction and I could buy like 1 8-ball once a month if I was lucky. And then I found this guy and I was paying a quarter of what everybody else was paying. So I started saying, well, I'll just buy some and then sell it, or I'll buy some and look out for my friends. And it was really profitable, at least initially. But then I started using more and more and more. And it got to the point where there was no way I was going to be able to sell enough because I was doing it all. So at that point, we ran out of money. And that's when we really started making desperate choices because we didn't see a way forward because there weren't enough jobs. And one of my buddies had pawned all the things he owned and we didn't know what else to do. So we turned to crime.
Jesse, there wasn't a part of you that was thinking about the after school specials of yesteryear. I mean, you're younger than I am, and the slippery slope of these things, and it will eat your life. And this is your brain on drugs. That maybe that's coming back. That perhaps if this was just a little cul-de-sac and exploratory thing, like I got to get myself out of it. I mean, I got to get back on track. I mean, I clearly I'm asking you as an outsider who's read your stuff, who's followed your stuff, who's listened to the pods. Where was that internal monologue? And also, were you seeing someone? Were you in therapy to kind of vent this stuff out?
I was not in therapy. I was briefly in high school. I was kind of in and out of therapy from my parents' divorce when I was 7. But I wasn't getting any professional help. I wasn't really opening up. I actually ran into a teacher a few years ago who said, I used to watch you in school and be horrified because I knew you were like, you were not okay, but nobody else seemed to notice. They just seemed to obliviously go by and act like it was okay. And you were every red flag in the world, but nobody would listen, which I thought was really concerning.
What were those red flags?
I think the kind of like manic behavior, the sleeplessness, and this is in school. Like it was the overachieving and then the crash. Like I would go and I would throw myself into something 1,000%, and then I would crash and I would feel hopeless and I would feel lost. And then I would find some new project or some new thing or some new friend group or some new girlfriend. And I would throw myself into it and then I would crash. It was almost like these manic depressive cycles. Now I've never been depressed as manic depressive, but it was definitely that. And I could see why she was concerned. And then I got in trouble at school, and it was one thing after another. And again, I didn't know how to stop because I think, well, it started innocently and it started feeling like it was going to be okay. It almost felt like I was fitting those stereotypes. I talked about my dad and his experience with drugs and crime and all these things that he'd done, and he painted a really hopeless picture. He said, addicts die addicts, like that's what we do. And in my mind, once I started, I felt like, well, I can't stop. Like, there's got to be an end to this, but like, I'm not in control. My dad told me my whole life, addicts aren't in control. It's a disease of addiction. We have no power. And so I think I kind of resigned myself to being on a roller coaster ride. And the reality is I could have made decisions to step off of it. But at that point, I either truly believed myself to be powerless to do so, or I found it easier to believe myself to be powerless to do so. So I just stayed on that ride.
What did you witness as a 7-year-old with that divorce? And again, I'm no psychotherapist. I don't purport to be one, but I actually feel kinship with you in kind of running away from something. I've been open about my personal traumas coming here as an immigrant and not knowing the language, having been dragged to school, being in a city that was in flames, many things. And I too ran away from that through achievement. And I would rise and there'd be peaks and valleys and crash and burn and crash and burn. And how much of you was mindful of what happened? I mean, I guess you were in the first grade when your parents had to tell you this, and you must have known that your father was unstable. Talk to me about that.
I I was not mindful. It wasn't until I went to prison that I realized a lot of my childhood wasn't normal, because I grew up and it was all I knew, and so I assumed that it was okay. Not long after my parents got divorced, my mom put my dad in the hospital. My dad was having an affair. That's why my parents got a divorce. It was a series of things that to me were just normal. I thought everybody does that. But the kind of like rage I saw, or the social connections I saw, or the things I experienced, yeah, I didn't realize that not everybody experienced those. And it wasn't until years later, I remember having a conversation with somebody in prison and thinking how bad his trauma was and explaining some things from my life. And he was like, man, I'm sorry you had it rough. And that's when it hit me. Like, if this guy thinks I had, like, oh, okay, like maybe I need to kind of reframe the way I look at my childhood. But yeah, it was definitely a searching, and it was a feeling of being lost and not knowing what to do or where to go. And it started at that point. It actually, I think, maybe started earlier. I mean, most of my family has said that, depending on who says it, either I was 5 or I was in 5th grade. There was a point at which the kind of light in my eyes just went off, and they don't really know. And I don't have any memory. I've definitely been in therapy for years trying to figure it out. And I've definitely cried on many therapist couches saying, look, I just want to know what happened. Like, I just want to remember, because I feel like that would give me some kind of ground to stand on. Yeah, there was definitely a point at which the light in my eyes went out, and I stopped being that like bright, curious, engaged kid and started being kind of a shell of who I'd been.
Full disclosure, I'm Roben Farzad. We're joined by Jesse Crosson. His book is The Best Part of Prison, The Power of Second Chances and Reclaiming Life Out of Darkness. After turning 18, he spent 19 years of a 32-year prison sentence in prison for robbery and drug charges. He has now committed his life to helping people find that second act and restructure and reinvent. I guess you do have to walk us through the criminal aspect of it. I guess the kind of the Boogie Nights robbery and everything that happened there. I mean, it doesn't jibe with everything that I hear and I read. And a person who's super self-aware to have kind of been, something like out of a cop documentary, The Next 48 Hours or something, or The First 48. Talk to me about those 2 years where everything went off the rails
So
and the
there
decision
wasn't,
to go bad, to break bad.
and it wasn't even 2 years. It was literally a matter of 3 months. It was 3 months from when I started cocaine to when I committed the robbery and the shooting. And it was, what is now, I think, self-awareness was just hyper anxiety and hyper self-consciousness for the longest time. I heard these voices in my head, and I might have heard or experienced or understood things, but I always experienced them as a lack. It was never an evaluation or an objective evaluation. It was always what is lacking or where I am wanting. And so no matter what I did, no matter what I realized, all I ever saw were the flaws, or all I really saw were the deficits. So it was constantly, whether through achievement or through drugs or through sex or through something that made it feel okay, trying to get past that, trying to fill that hole or fill that void. And, we had, like I said, I was working construction, and then I found this really good coke connection. And then I started living the high life because I was able to sell it and make money. But as we continued to do more and more, we got to the point of desperation where I had lost my job at that point. Everybody I knew had lost their job. My buddy had pawned all of his stuff. We had nothing left to sell. We didn't know what to do. And one of my buddies, one of the guys I was hanging out with, sat us down. He got us each a beer and he sat on the couch. And he proceeded to tell us a story about this employer he used to have. And he said they were really terrible people. They only employed undocumented immigrants, and they only exploited them, and they kept all the tip money, and they were just terrible. And if we stole from them, then it would be okay. So it was this very Robin Hood-esque story that, to me, as a kid who was focused on justice and things being fair, felt like, oh, I could do that. Like, that could be okay. But in the justification, we're the ones who need it. Like, we're the poor that are being given back to. No, it was entirely a lie. But in that moment, it felt like something that we could do or a path that we could take.
Had you had a gun before? Had you had any experience outside of petty theft, grand larceny or anything in doing this?
I had worked in construction, and I was making ends meet and had little side hustles. And once I started selling cocaine, I felt like I was rolling in money because I was getting it so cheaply from this guy that I could make money and I could buy things. I could take people out to dinner, and it felt like this extravagant lifestyle. And then as we continued to do more and more, and it stopped being that we're selling 90% and instead started being we're using 90% and trying to sell 10, we could no longer support ourselves. So that was when, after Daniel sold everything, pawned everything, everybody kind of like worked their side hustle, ran out all their favors. That was when we turned to crime.
How do you have experience in crime? So with the gun and everything, I'm not talking about heat. I'm not talking about boogie nights. You guys are avid recreational users, and there's a fork in the road where you could have said, "Ooh, capitalism. We're all consenting adults. I have a good source. I'm an arbitrageur. I could step on it." Back in my day, in my research, they would use baby laxative to cut it, to step on it. But you guys were using it, and maybe you weren't as incented to double down on being a cocaine kingpin.
Yeah, I mean, I remember we watched the movie Blow, and we, rather than being horrified, which I think is the intention of that movie, we're like, oh, that looks great. Like, yeah, let's do that. And I think that's the kind of horror of being young and naive and not understanding, is you can watch a tragedy and somehow see it as an inspiration or a life that you want to emulate. But so I remember when I first started doing cocaine, I started getting more and more paranoid. And I never owned firearms. I grew up in the country, and it was a very normal thing, but I just never had guns. My dad was a convicted felon. I think he had guns when I was young, but then
what was he a convicted felon for?
Any number of things. My dad was one of those people who never did any serious amount of time. To give you an example or a story from my dad's past, he sold 5 pounds of marijuana to a federal agent. They then raided his farm and found 2,000 pounds of marijuana in his barn. He agreed to testify or agreed to make a statement, went on the run, was on the run for 15 years, got caught growing 4 plants of marijuana in his backyard in Louisa County, was arrested and was sent back to Arizona to face federal charges. And the judge said, son, you've got to be the luckiest son of a bitch I've ever seen, because the agent has died. This evidence has been lost. This file has been misplaced. Like, we're going to charge you with, possession of whatever, like literally like a misdemeanor charge where you're going to get 6 months suspended. So my dad got caught with more than 2,000 pounds of marijuana and got more time in Louisa County, Virginia for the 4 plants he had in his backyard. It was just, he was one of those people who everything that he did, he was involved in riots. He was involved in like violent objection to the Vietnam War, anything you can think of, but he never really faced the legal consequences. And I remember after I got arrested, that's what he said. He said, this is my fault. Like, these are the sins of the father being visited upon the son.
Set the scene of the stick up, the hold up, the shooting, everything.
Sure. So one of the guys that I was running with grabbed us all a beer and sat us all down in Daniel's house and said, hey, I know this family and I used to work for them, and they're just terrible people. Like, imagine Cinderella's family. They abuse all their immigrant workers. They don't give them their tip money. They don't give them cash. Like, they just keep it all. There's going to be $50,000 in a bag somewhere in that house they stole from all these people that work for them. And so we painted ourselves as the heroes, as like the Robin Hoods who were liberating from the rich to give to the poor, while also saying that we were the poor that needed it. And we said, okay, well, we can justify this. Somehow it became okay in our minds. It became something that we could do. And we got closer. And I remember we went there that day. We actually went and we were going to go to the house, and we didn't understand what to do because there were cars out front. It was a house. People lived there. But we had so little forethought. We were so strung out and so just wasted all the time. We didn't think that it would be a bad idea to just like drive up to a house where people lived and expect them to not be there. And so they actually called us in. I remember I got off my motorcycle and everybody else was in the car, and Juan, the guy who told me, ran back and they waved to him. They said, hey, Juan, we remember you. Like, come on in, have some juice. And so I find myself in this house with Juan being talked to by these people who spoke very highly of him and said he was a great employee and they wished he would come back, and not really understand what was happening. And then we kind of got out. He got on the back of the motorcycle with no helmet, and we just drove off. We went around to the back of the property, and to show how delusional we were, we had just had this incredibly awkward exchange that like nobody would ever forget. And it didn't even occur to us that if somebody broke into their home, we would be suspects. we didn't think that through. Like, there was no rational thought going on. So we snuck through the woods. We parked in the back of the property somewhere, like back on some dirt road, and snuck through the woods thinking we were like running some special operations and we were going to like break in and steal all this money and then liberate it. Probably everybody saw us and heard us. And I mean, we were out of our minds. And when we went, Juan and I went to break in, Oscar stayed out front, and Dan went to the front door because the cars were gone. So we figured nobody was there, except there was a maid there. So I was imagining Dan would knock on the front door, and if somebody answered, he'd yell, "Oh, I didn't know anybody was here. I'm a salesman." He would do something distracting. Instead, he knocked on the front door, and then he stuck a gun in the face of the woman who answered the door. So while we were breaking in downstairs thinking we were doing a breaking and entering, he turned this into a robbery and into abduction. So I didn't even realize that until I went upstairs, and I remember seeing this like rustling, and I couldn't tell if it was a person or what was going on. And I was running frantically through the house looking for this bag of money that it turns out didn't exist. And so it didn't really click. And we got outside, and I had a bottle of liquor and a digital camera and some like costume jewelry. I mean, something that maybe cost $50 or $100. And we had just created this incredible trauma and havoc in these people's lives for nothing, for something that we had imagined that Juan had told us would be there that wasn't. And I remember going back, and that was when Dan started telling us what had happened. He said, "Yeah," and she opened the door, and I said, "She who? Like what?" And that's when we got kind of the gravity and the enormity of what we had done. Because before that, we thought we were breaking into someone's home. Like, obviously there was harm, but we didn't understand. We didn't think it was human harm. It was just things. But no, there was a family whose space was violated, who God knows if they ever feel safe. Like, there was a person whose space and body was violated. Like, it was the most unacceptable thing ever, but we didn't get it. We didn't come into it with the forethought. And that's one of the reasons I'm so critical when we say, oh, you just need to make better decisions and not go to prison. Like, people who are strung out on drugs, people who are in places of trauma are not thinking rationally. They're not making good decisions. You can't just say, okay, these are the consequences and you won't do it. No, it's a place of panic. It's a place of survival, and all the instincts are misaligned.
So you still up the ante over that. I mean, a gun went off, all this stuff the judge faced you and really threw the book at you. Fill those blanks in for me.
Sure. So the gun was separate. So a few days later, 2 days later, I had found another cocaine dealer that we didn't already owe money to, that somehow was naive enough to believe that we were good stewards of his cocaine, got a bunch of it, threw a party. And so we were sitting there, and we were trying to recreate the good old days where somebody had brought liquor and somebody else had brought cocaine, and we had our cocaine, and we were like thinking it was okay. We were, back in the Scarface era. And one of the guys who had actually stolen the gun, or excuse me, had bought the gun from somebody who stole it and then sold it to me, the one that I was carrying, he answered the phone and was panicked. I could see the fear in his eyes. And his pregnant girlfriend was in her trailer, and two guys were there, and they said, "Hey, you're going to bring us that gun or money or cocaine or else." So they're threatening his pregnant girlfriend. He doesn't know what to do. He explains to me that, yeah, these are the guys who stole the gun that I sold to you. And I said, well, look, tell them to give me the money back and we'll do that. And he said, and they said, no, we're not giving you shit. You're going to come back and you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And so all of a sudden, this guy, I'm just watching him panic. And after being the bad guy in this robbery, after being somebody who caused all this harm, I wanted to be the hero. Like, imagine putting my cowboy hat on and thinking I'm going to save the day. So I got on the phone and I said, y'all are going to leave or else. And then they threatened me with or else. And we escalated and escalated. And then we finally agreed to meet. And it didn't click in my brain, again, that this was a bad idea. I was acting irrationally. I was acting out of this animal place. Like, I'm going to protect my friend. I'm going to protect this girlfriend. I'm going to be the hero, not realizing that I was just creating more problems. But we went there. We actually all went there together. We ended up getting separated. So I pull in by myself. And there's this moment where I stop and there's nobody there. And I stop and I breathe. And it starts to hit me that I'm kind of panicked. Like, and not a good, like, feeling in my chest from cocaine, but a panic feeling in my chest. So I got out and I started trying to walk into this grocery store, not realizing it's 2 a.m. So the grocery store is not going to be open. And this car comes screeching in and slams right next to my truck. And 2 guys get out. And I realized, like, oh shit, like, these are the guys and like, they're going to hurt me. So even though I had the gun in my belt, I didn't think about it. I just wanted to get away. So I ran back to my truck, got in my truck, and I drove off, and they started chasing me. And I remember just being so afraid and panicked. And like, I knew I had created this. I knew this was my fault, but I didn't know how to get away. And I was like, just leave me alone. It kind of reminded me of every time I had been picked on or every time I had felt less than in my life and someone had like put me into a corner, and that rage that I had not acted out of, or that cowardice that I blamed myself for, all that combined with the fear just created this perfect storm of finally when the passenger who had been, racing and waving his hands out the window reached around behind him to grab something. In my mind, I knew he was grabbing a gun. I was like, they stole this gun. They have guns. Like, that's what he's doing. So as he reached around, I pulled the gun out of my belt and just started squeezing. And I only remember squeezing once. I don't have a clear memory, but I also remember this concussion and not being able to hear and not understanding what this liquid on my face was, and that the car wasn't there anymore. And then looking at the gun, and the slide was racked and it was empty, and I just dropped it and didn't know what was going on. And it finally like came rushing back in. The music from the stereo, the wind from outside, everything came rushing back in, almost as if I was coming back to consciousness. And I realized that I had just unloaded a pistol at two people. At that point, I didn't know if I'd hit anybody. I didn't know what had happened, but I know their car had slammed to the side of the road. And I drove home, and I had to come up with a story, because the friends that I had, I thought of as like my brothers or as my family. And so I was trying to explain to them, and I knew it wouldn't be good for them if I had just shot two people for no reason. So I said, well, they definitely had a gun. Yeah, I saw it. He reached for it and I saw it. And I never did. But I needed some way to justify that in my mind. And Juan, the guy who had organized the robbery, just yelled at me and said, you effing idiot. I can't believe you did this. This is your fault. And I remember him leaving the room, and we used to always say we were como hermanos, like we were like brothers. That was our kind of like bond. And I said, oh, like, please, just kind of pleading to him in Spanish, like, tell me we're still like brothers. He said, no, like, we're like friends. And he basically just spit on the ground. And I remember feeling crushed in the same way I did when my parents were divorced, in the same way I did every time a girlfriend broke up with me, or I had a fight with a friend. Every time I felt less than, it was just a recreation of that times 1,000. And I just remember giving up, and that was it. I thought my life was over.
Full disclosure, stay with us. This show podcast to NPR, Spotify, YouTube, all of the fine podcatchers. I've put them at one nice link for you, fulldradio.com. Again, fulldradio.com. Please subscribe, rate us, recommend us. We can use your stars. We can use your traction. I'm still trying to figure out the whole Instagram, YouTube thing. So throw love our way. And of course, my DMs are always open. A holler out to our radio listeners on WVTF Radio IQ across the great Commonwealth of Virginia, including Charlottesville, Richmond, Roanoke. We are on WPVM in Asheville, North Carolina. We are on KPPQ out west in Ventura, California. Holler if you too would like us on your air. If you're just joining us, my guest is Jesse Crosson. He spent 19 years of his life on a 32-year sentence. When he went to prison shortly after turning 18, he was pardoned by Virginia's then governor, Northam, in 2021. And he's here telling us the story of his Second Chancer Foundation, his reinvention. The Best Part of Prison is the name of the book, The Power of Second Chances and Reclaiming Life Out of Darkness. You then have to fast forward to the morning of your sentencing. And what was going in your head? I think the withdrawal must have kicked in while you were, I don't know, were you on bail? Were you in jail, county jail, awaiting sentencing? You had to lawyer up. You had to fess up to your mom.
So I was never granted bail. I was arrested. I was the only one of my co-defendants who didn't make a statement. So that led to the kind of disparity in sentencing. And yeah, I went to the jail, and I remember I slept for 3 days. I sat in that isolation cell where they stick you for quarantine, and I only woke up long enough to pee or to eat the food they put on the slot, and then went back to sleep because I hadn't slept in weeks. I hadn't slept well in months. Ever since I found cocaine, like I wasn't able to regulate my body or my nervous system. So I was in the jail, and I remember thinking, oh, well, I'll get bail. I'll be out in a day or a week. And then they denied bail, and then they denied the reconsideration of the bail. And I was there, for about 10 months by the time I was able to plead guilty and go to sentencing. And so the morning of sentencing, the guidelines called for from 8 to 13 years. The guidelines are based on basically the statistical norms for a state of what someone gets for a crime. And so it's used to guide the judge to determine what sentence to give someone. So my lawyer had said the guidelines are 8 to 13 with a midpoint of 10. You did some really bad stuff, Jesse. You need to go to prison, but like 10 years you can do. You can figure out a way to make it. And so I did. I said, okay. And I was going to plead guilty no matter what they did because I did it. Like there was no defending the things I'd done. I had so much shame. I had so much guilt. I had so much self-hatred. I had so much regret for the pain I'd caused my family, no less the people that I'd harmed directly, that I was going to do it. But I remember thinking, okay, 10 years, like that's half the life I've lived. I'm 18, but like I can do that. And then the first thing the Commonwealth did when I walked in for sentencing was make a motion to modify the sentencing guidelines, saying that one of the bullets had struck and caused permanent damage, that he didn't have full use of his wrist or his thumb. And that was accepted by the court. So now the guidelines called for from 10 and a half to 16 and a half years with the midpoint of 13. My lawyer said, look, it's a tough break, but yeah, you're going to do 13 years. You just got to accept it. So we went through this process. And the thing that really stands out to me was Brian, one of the guys that I shot, came up to the stand and gave his statement or gave his testimony. And I remember being just covered in shame because I saw the bullet wound. Like I had shot him and hit him in the jaw, and I could see the scar. I could see where he was hit. And I saw that I had permanently disfigured him. And I thought that was the worst he could get until he stepped down and his grandmother was called up. And this little old woman with this slow gait made it up there. And I just felt the room go just empty. And then she described hearing the news that her grandson had been shot and believing that he was going to be dead by the time she got to the hospital. And I just felt as empty and as full of just shame and self-hatred. And I just felt as rotten as I possibly could. But I remember I made a point of like meeting her eye when she looked at me, and she looked at me with sheer hatred, and she had every right to. And I just remember thinking, like, I have to take this. Like, the least I can do is take this. She gets down. We eventually go, and the judge says, well, I'm going to pronounce sentencing. And he does it. I had 12 felony convictions. I pleaded guilty to 12. So he said, 20 years with 10 years suspended and 15 years with 5 years. But it's all these numbers, and nobody's really understanding. And I'm doing the math in my head, and I'm like, that can't be right. At the end, my lawyer stands up and says, Your Honor, what is the total sentence? And the judge says, I don't know. I just told you. So the court reporter had to go back and read back and do the math. And I had been sentenced to 138 years with 106 suspended. So an active sentence of 32 years, which was twice the high point of the guidelines. And I had done the math before. And I just remember thinking, like, all right, like, I knew I wasn't enough. My entire life I've known I wasn't enough. Like, this judge proved it. Like, the deepest insecurity I've ever had, like, yeah, he validated it. I knew I was a piece of crap. And like, at least I can know that like everybody knows now.
Where did you do your time initially? And tell me about that first day, about intake.
Sure. So I was at the jail for about another week. And then they actually called me for transport to DOC. And I remember driving up to this ancient old red brick building that just looked like something out of Shawshank, or just looked like something just ancient and broken. And it was over 100 years old. We had these like 4 tiers or 3 tiers of like hundreds of feet where if you get thrown off that tier, you're not going to do very well. And it was terrifying because I'm walking in, at that point I was still 18 years old. I was still, 150 or 155 pounds, walking into a prison full of grown men who I thought were like my enemies or thought would see me as prey, or I didn't know what to do. So I remember being overwhelmed, but then they took me to the cell and there was this little old man in the cell with me. I remember thinking, okay, like at least this is kind of safe. And it was a little guy and he sat there and he smoked cigarettes and went to sleep. And so I was like, okay, at least I'm safe in the cell. I just have to worry about out here. But what I saw was I was a young, dumb kid, and I thought I needed to react, or I needed to make a name for myself, or I needed to stand up. And most of the people there just wanted to do their time. They just wanted to be out of the way. Now, some people wanted drama, but people just wanted to be okay. I think everybody in jail and prison on the street just wants to be okay.
That's really the prevailing sentiment where, I've spoken with people who are in the system and everything. They realize that it's in no one's interest to be flashy, to be flamboyant, to be super violent, to be shivving left and right, and to be bullying people. That the more we all kind of get along and make this dystopian ecosystem work, the easiest it is for all of us, and the less time we might even serve.
Yeah. The downside is, and I look from the gang perspective, so the gangs operate on order, and the less problems they create, the fewer issues with the guards, the easier it is for them, the more money they make, the more power they wield. But the young guys get status based on doing something or making a name for themselves. So you have the old heads trying to like maintain order and maintain peace, and then you have the young guys wanting to jump somebody or wanting to stab somebody or wanting to make a name for themselves because that's how they gain in rank. It's a really broken system. You call it dystopian, and that is the best description of it. But it's generally, it's young guys who are kind of out of control, or it's the fact that we have criminalized mental illness and we have criminalized addiction. So prison is full of drug addicted people who are struggling with mental illness. We just recently had the first murder of a correctional officer in the line of duty in Virginia. And I was at his memorial yesterday, yesterday, I think. And it was heartbreaking because this was a guy who said the night before, if you let me out of the hole, somebody is going to get me, or I'm going to stab somebody else, because he owed a gang a bunch of money and he knew they would get him. They let him out the next morning, and first thing, he stabbed this officer. He killed this officer because he was afraid, but also because he was struggling. I mean, he had 2 years left on his sentence. This was not like a rational, evil thing. He was clearly lashing out the same way as I was when I was on cocaine. He was out of his mind, and they didn't listen to him when he said, if you let me out of the hole, I'm going to stab somebody. So they let him out, and this happened. And again, if we had provided the mental health services in the first place, or we'd provided the secure addiction facility in the first place, this probably wouldn't have happened.
What about your addiction? There are people out there, there were longtime cocaine users that say it's not addictive. They go back to the 1970s explanation. It's not like we're talking about freebasing or crack cocaine here. This is the champagne of drugs. You don't have a hangover. You might crave it all the time. You might crave the high, but you weren't getting any of it when you were in the county jail. And was there still a fix when you were on the inside of the penitentiary?
Well, I will say I was definitely freebasing and smoking crack. I was doing any variety. When my nose was so clogged that I couldn't snort anymore, I would cook it up or I would freebase it. And while cocaine was not physically addictive, I have friends who were addicted to heroin, addicted to other things that had a physical response. It was the most mentally addicted because, like I said, when I didn't have it, I felt like I was drowning in a way that nothing else in my life. I've literally been drowning.
What did you do on the inside when you didn't have a steady source of this stuff? What?
I hadn't slept for days, so I slept for 3 days. And I
And then
think
after
by the
that,
end
it's
of
not
that,
like delirium tremens or no. Really, this is full disclosure. I really do want to
yeah,
know because if there was a system, if there was an intake system, and understanding the person has a substance abuse, if we're truly intaking him, there'd be mental health. Happy, other people would get methadone consultations, would be in the clinic. I mean, you have to have some modicum of stability, some modicum of order. It's the humane thing to do. Were you offered any of that?
no, none of that was offered. None of that is now. Thankfully, I've gone back in to speak at prisons, and they do have medication assisted treatment now. They are looking at different ways to do things. But yeah, when I went in, that was a pipe dream. There was nobody who was going to help anybody. If I wanted to see mental health, I had to sign up for a list, and I'd be lucky to see somebody in 6 months. Like the jail just didn't have the resources to do anything like that. So no, I mean, I went in and I had been drinking very heavily. Like I don't know whether I qualified for DTs or not, but there was definitely in that first day of like passing out and then waking up and not being in a good place and being delirious and shaking and not knowing why. And I don't know if that was trauma from the shooting and trauma from the things I'd been through. I don't know if that was my physical body and the addiction to alcohol. I don't know what it was, but I was definitely a mess. And thankfully, then there were not a lot of drugs in the jail. I remember getting a little bit of marijuana like 6 months later at the jail. Somebody gave to me because I gave him my newspapers. But otherwise, there weren't any drugs in the jail. We had cigarettes. That was the only thing. Guys would buy cigarettes from the guards and then roll up these tiny roll ups and sell them and make money and kind of like do the capitalist system there. But then once I got to prison, what do you want? Do you want crack? Do you want dope? Do you want, the only thing I didn't see a lot of was acid. It was there occasionally, but generally anything you were looking for, you could find.
And there was no drug testing or people just generally looking the other way while you used?
There was drug testing. You could go on a random sheet or a hot sheet. Once you'd been caught once or you'd been suspected once, you'd be on the hot sheet. But the consequence was you go to the hole and then you come back out. Some guys, I remember one guy who was doing all his time day for day. He was under parole, so he'd been locked up for 30 years at that point. And he was like, I don't care. Like, I don't care about parole. I'm going to smoke weed and you're not going to stop me. And at that point, they just stopped testing him because they were like, we've given him 20 dirty urines. Like, what else can we do to him? This just doesn't make any sense anymore. But it was to the point where, especially with marijuana, yeah, you can't hide it. Like you can try to blow it up the vent and blow powder and do this, but they can smell it and they just turn the other way because it wasn't worth it to them.
Full disclosure, I'm Roben Farzad. Our guest is Jesse Crosson. He is the author of the book, The Best Part of Prison, The Power of Second Chance and Reclaiming Life, Second Chances and Reclaiming Life Out of Darkness. He had spent 19 years in prison after he was sentenced at age 18. And now he's alive to talk about it. And he's a torchbearer for prison reform and prisoner advocacy. Were you the victim of violence? How did you find a niche? How did you find like a little cul-de-sac that was semi-safe and stable considering all the hard time you had to do?
Prison was not a pleasant place, but it also wasn't as terrible a place as I imagined. I definitely witnessed a lot of violence. I was definitely the victim of violence, and I was at times the perpetrator of violence. It was not the ecosystem we think of, though. It wasn't something from the movies. It was people just trying to live their lives. And generally, it was people who lacked emotional regulation skills. It was people who lacked communication skills and people who lacked resources. If you have a bunch of people in scarcity who don't know how to resolve conflict, being stuck in a small place together, and yeah, there was a lot of conflict, but there were ways to avoid that. And one way was that I was incredibly privileged that I had family support. So I didn't have to fight somebody over their tray because I was able to get commissary. I was able to get another tray. I was able to be relatively comfortable within that situation. And as far as the role, I tried a lot of different things. I tried being the guy who worked out. I tried being the guy who did whatever. But what really defined me was helping other people. I had this guy.
How? What was the turning point of that you decided, if I have time, this is what I can do. This is how I can make a U-turn in here?
I distinctly remember. So I had moved to the non-smoking pod, and there was this guy in there who was a heavyweight boxing champ of the prison. He was 6'6", 270 pounds, 280 pounds. And I was terrified because like he had grabbed somebody by the shirt to hit him and literally ripped the shirt off his body, like torn his hand. And it was like, okay, this is like something out of a movie. He came up to me one day and looked very sheepish and like boyish and said, "Hey, will you help me get my GED? Somebody said you could help." And I was so blown away, but also so impressed because this guy had like humbled himself to come to me to ask for my help.
Were you known as the bookish one, the schoolish one? Were you already pursuing the GED? The college degree? You were a graduate.
No, I was enrolled in college, but yeah, I was always reading, I was always studying, I was always doing something. So I think I kind of earned that reputation. And so somebody had recommended that to him, but I had also gotten an idea from somebody before that really helped me. And he said, if somebody's never gotten anything for free in their life, they're not going to trust you if you offer them something for free. So whenever somebody asks for your help, charge them something, but charge them something they can afford to give you. And I've lived by that. So in that moment, I wasn't going to ask him for ramen noodles or for anything else. I said, well, you know how to box. Like, teach me how to box and I'll make sure you get your GED. And I remember he smiled, he perked up, and he was so excited because in addition to the fact that he was going to get his GED, he got to like feel that place of value and that place of worth that he got to help somebody else. And I think we always imagine that someone in prison is hardened, and we all just want to be useful. We all want to be helpful. We all want to have
I
meaningful
do have to
existence.
ask you where this pivot to enlightenment. I mean, were you reading? Where did you understand that you could kind of do this double bottom line thing? Where were you emotionally secure enough and recovering from your bruises enough? See if you understand me in terms of saying, I'm not going to tell him to piss off. I'm not going to do all this. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to leverage this for maximum gain, but I'm going to be an enlightened prisoner. I want to know what the inception of that enlightenment is. Was there a mentor? Was there something you read?
There was a lot that I read. I mean, I read every religious text I could get my hands on. I read every spiritual text. I read every self-help book. I read every meditation book. I was just hungry. I was a sponge for knowledge and perspective. And I don't think I had a coherent view of the world then. I have a more coherent philosophy now. But at that point, I had just picked up enough and I had found those people. And I did. I had mentors and a guy named Greg and a guy named Danny, a couple people who just taught me things that made sense. And that was really the it wasn't that this was some grand idea that I could process and I could angle. It was like, hey, that hit me in my core. Like, it makes sense to me that if nobody has ever given me anything for free, I'm going to assume it's a trick. And I was surrounded by people, many of whom had never gotten anything for free and had many times been tricked every time somebody offered them. So it made sense to me because I was surrounded by that trauma and the stories that I had. When we would just sit around eating or sit around talking or working out, I would hear these stories over and over, the things people experienced as children. And it was like, no, like there has to be a different way. Like there's no way that I can relate to people in the way they've been related to in the past, because no wonder they're angry. No wonder they're violent. And he was a perfect example of this. This guy who came to me and humbled himself had come from a background that was so bad that the people in the very bad neighborhood he came from were like, yeah, he had it bad. And I remember when one of the guys from that neighborhood said that, I was like, man, when you come from a place of poverty and violence and just like everybody's father, everybody's brother is incarcerated, you're growing with a single mother, you're growing up in abusive homes, you're growing up, and that guy has it bad, like how bad did it have to be?
So you thought back then to your childhood experiences, and then I think you're very adept at using trauma, the word trauma, which gets thrown around a lot, and people get faulted generationally. Maybe you're calling trauma what other generations, Gen Xers and Boomers and the greatest generation people might have called just grit or roughing it, or it was just paying my dues and other things. But we are right now at a point in history where trauma is held out, and we're encouraged to hold it up and face it, and even the acknowledgement of trauma is medicinal. Maybe I lack the words to explain that. But as you put your head on a hard pillow every night and you're comparing your lot in life to some of these most hardened criminals who came from abuse, physical, otherwise, who came from various homes, homelessness, various levels of neglect and horror at a very young age, it, I guess, forced you to appraise what brought you there.
Well, first, I felt very lucky. And I don't think I was ready to make an honest approximation or an honest analysis at that point. There were steps because when I heard some of these horror stories, I couldn't relate. I was like, oh, well, I had it so much better. Like I didn't go hungry. Like we might have had state cheese but like we were okay. And what it finally took was the breaking down of those barriers. My father died while I was incarcerated. And I remember going back, and it was almost like the moment he died, there was a switch that flipped because I started to look at things. And rather than seeing this guy that I had idolized or I had looked up to, I saw like, oh, he was kind of a hypocrite. Like, oh, he was kind of an ass when he did that. Or I remember at one point when I was younger, he was called sanctimonious by somebody. And I looked it up because I didn't know what the word meant. And I was like, oh, that's not true. But it started to hit me like he was kind of sanctimonious. And I think his arc was a moral arc. I think he was very much a different person when he died than he was, when I was younger, before I was born. But I looked at his past and I realized that I had learned from that. Like I had idolized that. I didn't know him now. I knew him back then. And that was the person that I looked up to. And that was the person I emulated. And yeah, I was probably going to be pretty flawed. And I probably had a lot of things I need to look at in myself. And And I still continue to find that. I recently, just the other day, was talking with somebody and was like, yep, got to put that on the list for my therapist, because things will come up even now at 41 years old.
When did you first see a therapist?
So I saw a therapist when I was young, again, when my parents got divorced when I was 7, and then a little bit off and on in high school, but not really. It was never consistent. I didn't see one in the jail, but when I went to prison, I was so miserable. And you kind of ask about that arc. Not only did I read those self-help books, I went to see mental health. And there was a huge stigma against seeing mental health in prison, because it was seen as it was weak, or it was going to, like, they would put it in your file and you would never get a release, or they would hold you forever. It was always seen as a derogatory thing. I didn't care. Like, I was on fire. I had thrown my life away. I needed to understand. That kind of curiosity that I had when I was a kid was turned to needing to understand, how did I end up here? And how did I become the person that would cause all that harm? Like, I'd shot people. I'd committed a robbery. Like, that wasn't who I was growing up. So how did I become that? And I was willing to talk to anybody and ask anybody and have any conversation or read any book that helped me get a better understanding. And I found some therapists who helped me along the way.
And was there a breakthrough conversation? Was there one thing? I'm always looking for an inception or a tipping point. It might have been your father passing away. It might have been resolving to get a college degree, which you could do remotely if you had all this time to spare, after all, on the inside, right? It's not a 4-year degree. It's not an associate's degree. You could get a 10, 12-year degree.
Well, it took me 15 years to get a bachelor's degree, just because of the delays and the barriers. But it was also, my mother had insisted on that. My mother had always been anxious, and she'd been a fixer. Like, whenever something happened, she didn't hold me accountable. She tried to fix it. So when I was in prison, she said, well, we're going to get you enrolled in college. Like, that'll make it okay. And it was her way of dealing with the anxiety and the hell that I put her through. And that was a thing that really did help me, because I started to see myself as a different person. And I don't know that there was a big moment, but I remember I had a philosophy 101 course, and the professor would answer my questions, because I would always write back the assignment, and I would write a bunch of questions, and he would write me back, like, essentially essay responses. He would write me back entire pages or multiple pages in response to my questions. And I remember feeling validated through that in a way that I didn't know how to describe, because I was like, he actually thinks I matter. Like, he actually cares if I get this information. And I hadn't felt like that, especially in jail and especially in prison. It's almost like Pinocchio. I felt like a real boy. And when you talk about the books or the moments, Tara Brach has a book called Radical Acceptance that absolutely changed my life. I still, I have it on audiobook, and I listen to it while I'm driving down the road. And there's a story in there about a little girl who goes to a diner with her parents, and the waitress says, and hun, what do you want? She orders something, and the dad says, no, you're going to have this. And the waitress looks right at her and says, and how do you want that? And she says, oh my God, she thinks I'm real. And I just remember streaming tears the first time I read that, because I was like, that's me. I don't know how, I don't know why, it doesn't make sense, but I feel in my heart that was me. And so there were those moments, there were those people, there were those books, there were those conversations that just flipped a switch. And I don't even understand what it was, but it did change my life. It changed the trajectory.
On one day in 2021, while some variant of COVID is still raging, you get paged, I guess, inside the prison system, where you had a routine. You would get up early to try to use the phones. You would meditate, have your coffee, breakfast, and whatnot. And you're summoned to see, is it the warden?
It was just a counselor.
And what happened?
So, this was at the lowest point in my time, because I'd been in prison for 19 years at that point. I had helped start a peer support mental health program. I had moved to the honor pod. I'd been able to play with dogs. I had written articles and gotten them published. Everything was great. And then COVID hit. And in the middle of COVID, all that had shut down. I'd been transferred to a dormitory where, rather than having a single cell, I was in a room with 81 people. I was hopeless. I was lost. And I'd gotten a job, and I was making the best of it. But I was at a very low place. And they called me in the office that day, and I remember I thought it was strange, because the counselor was very strict about the protocol. She would always have a mask, and if you didn't have a mask, you could not come in her office. But she was there with no mask, and I had a mask on. She said, come on in, Jesse. And the phone was off the ringer, and I could hear somebody on speakerphone, and she said, oh, Mr. Crosson, are you sitting down? And I said, no, why? And this is fairly similar to how I found out that my dad had died. And I was like, oh, Jesus, what happened? But I saw that the counselor was so excited, and the person on the phone said, you've been granted a conditional pardon. You're going home today. And I just remember, my body collapsed. I hit a knee. I was shaking. I couldn't process that I was going home. I had 10 years left of my sentence. I was going to go take a shower. I had just finished doing burpees. My life was prison. My life was not the outside world. But I had been granted a conditional pardon by the governor. And an hour and a half later, I walked out of the gate.
Now, in between that, I clearly read the story here. You wanted to give your possessions away. You felt an affinity with the people that you crossed paths with, that, a TV wasn't going to do you anything. The clothes that you had, that you would, you'd put on the inside. If you go back to 2002, we were using what, flip phones. I don't know what you were wearing. They clearly put you in. I don't understand the embarrassing prison garb that they had to make you look like a sharecropping prisoner from the 19th century or something. But it was all very sudden. And you gave stuff away and your mom was waiting for you on the outside. Please walk me through that.
Yeah. So I remember, when they said that, I went and took a shower because I was sweaty and I still didn't believe it. But before I got in the shower, I called this kid over, this young kid who didn't have anything. And I said, hey, I'm going to give you all this stuff. And I put all my commissary and all my stamps and all my whatever in a bag. And I said, hold on to this. Like, if I come back, I'm going to need it back. But if not, like, you can have it. And he was scared because I think he thought I was going to go fight somebody because, like, I don't know. He'd know I had arguments with guys over the phone or but I went and I signed the paperwork. And I remember they called me into the front office and I'm looking at this and the lady joked. She said, oh, you better sign it or we're not going to be able to let you go until next week. And I remember, like, where's the pen? Like, yeah, of course. And I'm reading this and I couldn't really understand. There were all these conditions I had to agree to. And I would have agreed to anything. If you want to manipulate somebody, have them in prison and say, just sign this, you'll sign anything. And I did. I went through these steps and I went to medical and I just did these things. And I remember coming back to the pod to get all my things and everybody stood up and started clapping. And it felt real. Like, if these people believed I was going home, and like I had people that I didn't even like who were giving me hugs and saying how proud of me they were and how excited they were, and it became real. And that was when the few things that I had left, I just was like handing away. And it was so funny because the officer said, oh, by the way, you need to make sure you bring all your stuff home with you. And I was like, yeah, I don't. And I remember just like they sat down on the bunk with their backs to me and I was handing stuff away behind them. And I was like, what are you going to do? Keep me here? Like, of course I'm going to give this stuff away. Like, this means something to somebody in here. And I really felt passionate about that because I felt numb about the things on the outside. It was almost like I was attaching to the few things that felt real enough that I could understand their process. So I made sure to give those things away. And they walked me towards the front, and there was a big sign on the yard that said, no inmates past this point. And when I walked past that, carrying my little bag of pictures and the few books that I took home, that was when it like hit me. That was when the numbness kind of like went down a notch and I started to feel that tightness. And then I walked to the front and there was my mother in the front of the prison. And I couldn't even talk to her because I had to be at a desk and sign all these papers. And she's like 20 feet away. It's COVID. I haven't seen her in a year and a half. We haven't like been able to give each other a hug. And I'm waiting. And then 15 minutes later, I finally sign all these papers and go over there and just pick her up. And I'm just so excited. And she says, Jesse, let's get the F out of here. And I just remember laughing because I was like, that kind of fits. And walking out, and the colors were brighter. The feeling, the sun was warmer. I don't know how to describe how alive the world felt. And then we got in the car and we just drove down to the end of the driveway. And it was magical. It was like a movie, but almost as if I was in a movie and experiencing it for the first time.
Now you talk about the all the stuff that hit you, maybe overstimulation once you stepped inside the Costco to buy some wares and provisions. One, I have to ask you, which I've always wanted to ask people, what was the first indulgent thing you ate? I mean, I know people who were transferred in between prisons who begged that transportation detail for a quarter pounder or a drive-through quarter pounder or something. What did you first indulge in, maybe on the way, and then what happened inside of that Costco?
I didn't eat. Well, the indulgence was my girlfriend at the time, who I'd never met in person because that's perfectly irrational. Ended up meeting at the end of the driveway, and I got in her car. I gave my mom a hug and said, we'll meet you in town. And we went to a small budget inn in Orange County and had some amazing time and some amazing memories, but I couldn't eat anything. There was no meal. I was so full of adrenaline, and so my gut was clenched so tight. There was no way I could stop to think about what I wanted. But we got to Costco, and before I had a breakdown, they had the big meat aisle, and I remember thinking, like, I want a steak. I haven't had a steak in 20 years. That would be amazing. And we got steak, and it wasn't but like one more stop before I just kind of hit the ground and just couldn't keep going. Like, it was like the world had just closed in around me, and it was so tight and so loud. I needed to not be there. And that's what I said. And my mom said, okay. Like, and so we went to the front and got the stuff and got in our car and went home. But I couldn't sleep. I didn't sleep for, I think, 3 or 4 days. So when everybody else went to sleep, when Courtney and I were downstairs and she just started snoring, I finally got up and I walked out on the porch, and I sat out on the porch, and I was so blown away that I could just open the door whenever I wanted and go wherever I wanted. And finally, after a couple hours of sitting out there and just like alternating between tears and joy, I remembered that they said there was ice cream. So I went inside and I found ice cream and had probably the most blissful, ecstatic, like 10 minutes of my life eating that ice cream.
So it wasn't a steak, or it wasn't, some people say Captain D's or shrimp or something that you clearly would not have gotten on the inside.
No, and we did. We made the steaks the next night because on the way home, my mother had said, "Hey, by the way, we won't be able to have that steak tonight." And I remember thinking, like, why not? Like, I've been waiting 20 years for this steak. What do you mean, no? She was like, "Oh, it's too late." I knew I wasn't going to sleep, but I went home and she had some stew in the fridge, and I remember I tried to take one bite, and I felt like I was just going to throw up. Like my whole body was revolting. I was like, "Yeah, you're right. We don't need this." And it wasn't until that ice cream, which was probably 12 hours after I got out, that I was actually able to keep anything down. And yeah, but I definitely ate. I mean, I ate ice cream every day for probably the next 3 months, but also steak and sushi and yeah, everything you could think of. I remember having and being so excited about because it was the first time in so many years.
So there was the flip phone era you that was on the intake in 2002, I guess, and coming out in 2021. This is the social media, Instagram, TikTok, iPhone, smartphone world. I mean, were you able to crib that stuff? Was there enough leakage on the inside that you were mindful of these things? You kept up with current events. Clearly, you got your bachelor degree, but there was a shock to the system. Whatever happened inside that Costco on a very meaningful, shocking day for you, right? When you thought you had 10 more years to serve.
Yeah, it took the technology, the culture, the getting out to a world of COVID was even more alien than it would have been because we're all social distancing and wearing
Yeah.
masks and separated. And the technology, I'd been really fortunate because I had kept up with current events. I'd read magazines and books and watched the news, and I tried to just be like a sponge and learn everything. But they had started selling these tablets, these kind of like for-profit email or music tablets that were the alternative to CD players or tape players they no longer sold. And they were basically decommissioned smartphones. So I got to be introduced to what it was to have a smartphone. And I remember the first time there was a video on there, I was like, wait, they show videos? Like I thought it was just pictures. Like this is insane. And so I remember playing with my mom's phone on the way home, and because she had set up a Facebook page for me, and that was how I had gotten so much support for my clemency petition, was because I would write stuff and send it to her, and she would post it, and people would be like, "This is amazing. We like this guy." So I'm looking at these comments and these people finding out that I'm getting out of prison, and it was something that I could focus on because when I looked out the windows of the car, it was too big. Like I didn't have a frame of reference to process it, so I could go back to like, okay, this thing, and this person said this nice thing, and okay, I can understand that, and then we would stop, and I would just be overwhelmed by the world, overwhelmed by nature, overwhelmed by the traffic, the noise, the everything seemed bigger and louder than I could have imagined.
Jesse, in the few minutes we have left, just a shared observation with you. One of the people who I interviewed for my book just told me that when he was in the hole and when he had the worst time in the penitentiary system, being transferred from bus to bus, in isolation, not in isolation, the only sunshine he would ever feel was through the mail that would get through, in the handwriting, in the paper, um, people's thoughts. And I was struck by what you said about that professor. Was it at Ohio University?
It was.
Remotely, who gave you, I mean, this is before you had full access. Maybe you were on core links and you had other email systems that were vetted, but a professor who gave you extra long philosophical interpretations. Put that on one side of the ledger, because there's now 2025 Jesse Crosson and me and millions of others of people seeing your TikTok and Instagram and your soliloquies, holding this phone and explaining these things. And me, gosh, how would this have happened in 1980 or 1990 or in a different era? It wouldn't have happened, right? You're connecting with people in such a different way that you put this out to the world. And I want you to close this out by telling us how the world has come back to you and how you filled out meaning in this and finding new purpose. I mean, you're being profiled by the ACLU, by the Charlottesville Alt Weekly, by the prison reform people out there, that clearly you're destigmatizing mental health on the inside and on the outside, and childhood trauma. That's a loaded question, but I want you to close us out.
I don't think it would have been possible. I came out, somebody has said that I'm a statistical anomaly, that when I got sentenced to twice the high point of the sentencing guidelines, which had already been modified, that was a statistical anomaly. When I received a conditional pardon that would have never happened before, that was a statistical anomaly. And that when I got out to the world of social media and had a story to tell, that was, again, it couldn't have happened any other time. It was just such perfect. And weirdly, so the person who gave us funding for Second Cancer Foundation is an extraordinary individual who's very well connected. And I remember the last time that I saw him, he said, "Yeah, I was talking to Tim about you the other day." And I was like, I'm sorry, I don't know who Tim is. He said, "Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple." Yeah, so we were talking about how iPhones have democratized the world and how you have this story and you can share it with the world. And that wouldn't have been possible without the iPhone. And I just remember thinking how bizarre it is that that's true, but also that I had somebody who could talk to the CEO of Apple about my story and how iPhones made it possible. And it's mind-boggling because the world is so fundamentally different now than it was 5 years or 10 years or 50 or 100 years ago. And we do have the ability to connect with and impact and be impacted by a world that we never would have seen.
So what motivates you now when you get up in the mornings? It's not that routine with the coffee and the meditation and the gym. And, I don't know if you're putting notches on the wall, Shawshank style or something else, or looking at the Raquel Welch poster. But now you have whole new meaning. You have a full book. You have, you have a book that came out. You have people wanting to interview you. You have bizarre Riverside requests like mine, right? Coming in. You're my neighbor now in Charlottesville, and I hope to have a bagel date with you. How are you? There's a whole new purpose, and you're not even 45.
It's so funny. Somebody sent me a reel this morning that was Carl Jung said your life starts at 40. And there was a lot of people, it wasn't so much that I felt this, but people telling me you miss so much and your life has been, you have to make up for time, but don't you feel like your life just isn't going to be what it was? And I think I started to be happy with myself for the first time in prison. It was the first time that I felt like enough. And that was what made me realize that it wasn't the place and it wasn't the external validation and it was me and how I chose to live my life and how I chose to show up in relationship with other people. And when I saw that I could help where I had previously caused so much harm, I began to be okay with myself. And so I think every day there's sometimes a desire to go back to that simplicity of getting up and the coffee and the meditation and the gym, because that's simple. And the world is a lot more complicated than that. But these days it's how can I make the best of this? How can I show up and be authentic to the person I want to be? How can I help improve the world or the ecosystem, the community around me? How can I show up for friends and family or a lover? Like how can I be that person? And a lot of that is professional. Some of that is personal. Some of that is this cat that I love more than anything that has been the best thing to ever happen to me. But it's just consistently trying to find ways to show up and be the person that I want to be. And when I do that, like I've definitely gotten lost in moments of wanting validation or wanting this ecstasy or wanting whatever. But when I do that, I feel empty. And when I show up and I be the best version of myself, however that is, I go to bed every night and I feel a sense of satisfaction. So I just keep coming back to that because that's the only thing I've found that gets me through the day that feels meaningful.
Jesse Crosson, the Second Chancer Foundation. The book is The Best Part of Prison. This is quite a reinvention. I mean, in the annals, there's Apple, there's Hyundai. You've really pulled one off, and to be top of mind for someone like Tim Cook. Give us your social media handles and everything so our listeners can follow you.
Sure, it's Jesse Crosson, Crosson, or Second Chancer. That's chance with an R. You can find me on pretty much all the platforms, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the chance to write a book, to be on a podcast, to tell stories, and to advocate for other people to get second chances.
Thank you, and please come back on.
Absolutely.
Full disclosure, special thanks again to Ian Stewart. If you are listening to us on the radio, note that while we cut for broadcast, the entirety of every interview is on podcast, whether on the NPR app, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. Find them all at one neat link, fulldradio.com. Again, fulldradio.com. And recommend us to a friend. And catch me on both CNN and NPR's Here and Now. I'm Roben Farzad. Thank you for listening. Back with you next week.